Hey there, Next Gen Hackers here. In this video, we're going to go over how to convert a written problem written by somebody else to pseudocode and then eventually to working code written in Python. Now, if you're not a Python developer, don't worry too much here. We're only going to end up writing probably about 10 or 15 lines of code, so feel free to follow along using your favorite programming language of choice. The focus of this video is really going to be on that workflow of going from vague problem or written problem to pseudocode to working code. Now, I did write out the problem here on this blog post, which I will leave a link to in the description. Right now, I'm hosting it from localhost because it's not available yet. It will be at the time that you watch this video. But we are going to do the live coding of this just live here, not just like copy pasting code from the blog post. But I think it will be important to go over the problem here in text form because that's how it came to me written in email. So yeah, this all starts with you can use this workflow to basically help convert feature requests or user stories or vague ideas into fully working code. Hopefully this is kind of a blueprint that you can apply in many different spots here. Now, in your day-to-day as a developer, you'll often be asked to convert a written or verbally explained problem into code. This could be anything from a couple of sentences with little direction to a fully mapped out user story. So I linked to Wikipedia here. We don't need to get into this now. Feel free to check that out on your own. Maybe I'll do future videos about user stories. Let me know in the comments below. So this could come from anyone, right? It could be someone who is offering you contact work. It could come from a team lead or a product owner, or even your own mind if this is something that you're working on your own, right? So basically all like this blueprint or workflow, it's going to apply to solo developers, contract workers, full-time employees, basically any and all developers ever, maybe. So here's the problem, and here's how I received it. Someone just emailed me directly, and they asked me to write a little bit of Python. All I did here was clean up the grammar a bit just to make it a little bit easier to read, but I tried to leave things mostly how they were in the email, so it's a little more reflective of how you might receive information in the real world. Like, I didn't change a lot of words here to make it more clear or anything like that. I just made the formatting a little bit nicer and fixed up some typos and minor things like that. So they sent me an email like this. So here's the situation. I have a website, example.com. At the moment, I want to contact this site and get back specific information, such as, example.com, settings, all server status. It shows unformatted information. I'm trying to make a script to find a specific word in the text and store it into a variable. By the way, side note, I'm going to start breaking this stuff down once I get through the entire email here. I just want to let you see this email in its original state here with no biases and just let you formulate how you would solve this. So this is the information. I changed some fields for security reasons, and then we just have a whole bunch of text over here, basically what they got back from the response here. So in one of the lines, there is a word called transparency, but this doesn't always appear in the same order for all of the sites. What I'm trying to achieve here is to be able to detect that word in the line, go to the field ID, and copy that field. I've been trying to do this for a week. How do you think it can help? So the way I read this one was, well, someone's been trying to solve a specific problem and now they need some help, whatever. But I didn't immediately go into problem solving mode here. So the first thing I actually did without even really reading the details of the email was I just asked them, like, what did they try so far? Now, this is, I don't want to get too deep into side topics here because this video's focus is on the workflow, but if someone just randomly emails me something asking for like a coding solution, I don't know, I'm happy to help people out, but there shouldn't be an expectation that I just sit there for X amount of time and reply back with, a fully working solution and a full breakdown of everything. I don't know. So that's why I asked them, what did they try so far? Because really I'm curious, what did they try so far? And that prompted them to reply back to me here. So they tried the library Beautiful Soup, and I printed out all the fields. After that, I was able to split them, for example, deleting the use of commas or any other symbols, but nevertheless, I have to assign the index number of the transparency word. What I'm trying to do is be able to return a certain amount of characters until the ID, then copy that ID and store it into a variable. So I just replied back then mentioning that the response from the site looks like JSON, which is structured text, and asked if they tried parsing it that way. Now, maybe now we can rewind a little bit. And well, okay, so they said they didn't know how to accomplish that and asked if I knew how. But before we get into the pseudocode, yeah, maybe let's rewind this a little bit here. So this is the email that they sent. And, once we got to this point here, it became sort of clear that they were trying to parse this response here just as plain text instead of JSON. So at the bottom of this post, I did write a takeaway section of sometimes there's unknown unknowns that make things a lot more complicated here. So if you were trying to parse that as plain text and you didn't know that was JSON, that is going to make things quite a bit more complicated. But in this case, yeah, so transparency, there is the word transparency there. And little things here, like in the same order for all the sites. When I read that originally, I just expected, that was all the different results here, not necessarily multiple sites here because they only mentioned one. So yes, now that we sort of understand what we need to do, basically, go through this payload here, let's call it that, look for the word transparency, which in this case is associated to a field called serverType. So basically, we just want to get all of these specific items here where the server type happens to be transparency. And then we just want to return back the ID of this specific item here, which in this case is 123. We can see we have different IDs for different ones. And yeah, so that's when I just started busting out pseudocode, and I just replied back to him in an email here. I also went to say here in the blog post that I don't know much about the situation, right? I also just don't want to answer immediately with code because this could be a homework assignment or a take-home test or something like that. Like, I'm not trying to give people answers so they can go and, take that as their own to do whatever they need to do, right? Like maybe pass an assignment. So I replied with, these are the steps that I would take. So I would parse the site response as JSON. I would then loop over that response because it is a list here. If we scroll up, we do have a JSON list here. So basically a list of dictionaries or objects. And then each object has a number of different properties there. But yeah, so let's loop over that. And then if the item's server type is transparency, then we'll go and store that item's ID, or basically do whatever you need to do, right? Maybe you just take this whole item and pop it into a new variable, or put it into a new variable, or you just get the ID, like whatever you want. So my thought process here, in specific to this email, is, I would hoping they would read these steps and then see that there's a path forward, right? Just by breaking down the problem, which is another blog post I wrote, by the way. I'll leave a link to that one in the description of the video. I wrote this one a long time ago, back in 2016. But yeah, so the idea here is like, you can break down this problem into bite-sized chunks and then solve them one at a time. So in this case, like each one of these things are something you could potentially Google and solve if you didn't know how to do each of these steps beforehand. But they messaged me back saying, asking for a code example because they didn't have enough Python experience to write the code themselves. Now at this point in time, yeah, it's hard to say, like, they're a student working somewhere, personal project, I don't know. Then I asked for them, for what it's for, and they said a personal project that they might use at work if they're able to do it. In that case, it is, I don't want to like make the problem smaller than it is, but it's not a lot of time investment to write this code here. And like, what is the harm in writing that code? So I figured, what the heck, why not? I'll just crank out some code here and reply back in the email. So yes, at that point, then I just actually ended up writing the code in the email, not even using the Python interpreter, although I did double check it afterwards and it was good to go. But yeah, so now the goal here is, one, we have a problem that was written by someone else. It could have been verbally, it could have been like a 2-liner Slack message, or, if it were a smaller problem, but we have the problem defined. Now it's our job to convert that into pseudocode, which we did over here. And lastly, it is now our job to convert that into working code. And that's the part we're going to do live in this video here. I don't just want to copy paste, the code down there below, but I'm going to close my eyes and scroll down for like a little bit. And then you can look at that. And then if you wanted to pause the video and just do that and bail, you can do that too. So there's like the final code. I honestly don't know if you can even see that. I feel like I'm scrolling down a little too far, maybe. I don't know. But okay, so that should be safe now. Yes, we're back to here. Okay, cool. So let's copy this here and jump over to a code editor. And spoiler alert, I do have the final demo here, but let's make a new file from scratch. Also, feel free to follow along using your programming language of choice here if you don't want to use Python. Now, let me just go here, open up the demo.py file and paste in those pseudocode steps here. And for now, they'll just be comments here. Let's also get rid of the first one there because we're not going to need that one. And this all begins now with parsing the site response as JSON. So let's go back to the email up here and we'll just copy this entire JSON response here and then bring it back over here, paste it in. This also needs to be inside of a variable. Let's just call this variable, I don't know, response sounds good for now. That needs to also be wrapped into a string here. Now, of course, in this case, we don't have access to their API server or whatever generated this response. So for now, we can just throw it in as a string and it would be up to them to then, make this the proper data source, whether that is coming from the request library. If you're using Python, could be curl, like, whatever it happens to be here. But the first thing that we need to do now is parse the site response as JSON. So we can then do response dictionary here, and we can use JSON that loads on the response. And this is a built-in Python module that we do need to import up here. But yeah, this is going to convert the string representation of this JSON that we have here up in this response variable to a proper Python dictionary. Now, I'm a big fan of seeing progress basically as I go. So in this case, what I would end up doing is I'd actually just print this out to make sure that it works. And then we can run Python 3 demo here. And we do see that we have a proper Python dictionary of this JSON here. We can see it down below. Let me scroll down a little bit. And yeah, at this point, we can get rid of that print here because we know that works. And the next step in the pseudocode here is to loop over that response because it's a list. So we can do for item in response dictionary here. And then what we could do is, you know, if you really wanted to take this step by step, you could print out that item here just to see that things still work here. Maybe that's not a really terrible thing to do here. Rerun this here, and now we can see that inside of our loop, we are printing out each individual item. Good. And what we need to do now, though, is check to see if the item's server type is transparency. So let's get rid of that print statement there and instead replace that with this if condition here. Actually, let me put it below the comment there. And now we can just do if item, and now we actually have a decision to make. So just to be super clear, item here is each item in the output there, but each of these items, it has all sorts of different fields in here. And one of them is server type, which we can see over here. And yeah, it's also here, but broken up into 2 lines and down there as well. And we have 2 options to get the value of that. We can either use square brackets like this, where we can do server type, or we can do item.get. And the difference between this is when you use square brackets, if the server type field doesn't happen to exist in this item over here, then it is going to throw an exception, where Python in this case is going to be like, hey, you know, that key's not found, figure out like what you need to do. Whereas if we use item.get, then what will happen here is this will return back none because it couldn't find the field, so it returns none. Or, you know, we have the option here to put in a default value if the server type field doesn't exist. Now, in this case, we really don't know if server type is or is not going to exist. That was not clear in the email sent. That's something, if this were like a real life problem, maybe you go and maybe ask the, you know, who's ever like product owner or someone like, are we ever going to get a payload that's not going to include server type? But for me, usually, generally, if I don't know, or maybe even if I do know, I'd like to be often a little bit more on the safe side. So I would use the get version of here because I wouldn't want that to necessarily throw an exception. But depending on what you're working on, maybe you do want the exception to be thrown so you can track it and then maybe fix the bug upstream. Like if you own the API producing this, because maybe all of them do need a server type and you want to see when you don't get it. Like those are very, very, very valid things to do. But in this case, I went for item.get here, and we just need to see if it's actually transparency here. And that takes care of this step here. Like if the item server type is transparency, like literally written to code is, you know, if the item .get here server type equals transparency, then we're good to go. And the next thing that we need to do here, let me also put it below that comment, is store the item's ID or do whatever you need, like append the whole item, blah, blah, blah. Let's just simplify that pseudocode to be store the item's ID. And at this point in time, like if we're going to be storing something, then we need a variable or something to do that with. And I'm pretty sure even in the email, they said that they want to put all the IDs into a variable. So in this case, let's make a new variable called, I don't know, transparent IDs. And that's just going to be an empty list for now. And then what we could do is we can just say transparent IDs.append. And then what do we want to append? In this case, we want to append the item. And we want to get the ID. Now, this is also another case where, well, do we use square brackets or do we use get? Now, since I don't have the context of like what this is being used for, I am making a personal assumption in that maybe this is a payload returned back from a database. The ID probably is always going to exist. You know, if it's a SQL ID, this could be the primary key. I'm just like taking guesses here that there's always going to be an ID. And if there's not an ID, then chances are I actually would want this to throw an exception and, you know, to get notified if that doesn't happen, because that usually means something is very wrong in the upstream provider, whether or not that's you who actually made this API or maybe a third-party API or something like that. So in this case, though, yeah, we're just taking that empty list of IDs here, and we're just appending a new item, the item ID. And then what we could do here is just print out transparent IDs. And if we rerun this, like what do we actually get? We do get back a single item here with 1, 2, 3. So there is that 1, 2, 3 here. And if we take a look at the server type, it is transparency, which is what we're detecting here. But if you look at another one with the ID of 4, 5, 6 here, this server type is whatever that is, QU API. That is not transparency. So we wouldn't expect that one to be there. And 789's server type is directive, also doesn't work. In a good way. So if we do transparency here, we would expect now to rerun this and then see 1, 2, 3 as well as 789, but we shouldn't see the 4, 5, 6. And yeah, that's the expected result there. Now, doing manual tests like this is really good, but at this point in time, like if this were a real feature, it would be a really good idea to start writing some tests for this, right? You can, have a response with different values here and run some assertions so that you have confidence there that it is getting the correct one. Now, there are a number of things that we could do to this code to make it a little bit more robust, but since we don't really know the nature of this business here, it's hard to talk myself into doing the extra work because, for example, if server type is not there, it's going to be none. That's going to not be transparent. That's fine. This will get skipped. Doesn't do anything. But, could transparency ever be written in uppercase? Because then this is going to be uppercase transparency, and that's not going to match that. So like that wouldn't work. And I'm sure, yeah, I mean, I doubt it's going to be written in like other ways. Like, it's very unlikely it's going to come in like that specifically where like that capital E is there, but that also wouldn't work because, yeah, this is just not going to match that because it needs to match that perfectly. Now, there's a couple of different ways that we can solve this problem here. For example, well, if you wanted to just capture if it's either uppercase or lowercase, like one option to do that is actually just change this to be a list here, and then we can do transparency like that. This should still return the same results, which is fine, no longer 789 because I did change that back to directive here. But if I change directive here to be transparency, now technically we should get both of them back. We do. And if we change this to be transparency in lowercase, that also is going to be fine. Or we can also undo that back to directive here, and then it's just going to give us the 1 here. This totally handles the case of it being transparency or transparency. I am yelling in your face. But there's other ways to do this as well, right? So if we change that back to equals, we could do, let's see, we could, it's so interesting. Like I've been working with Python for a long time, but it's like a little embarrassing. Like sometimes I have to find myself thinking, like if I wanted to convert that to lowercase, is it like that to lower like that? Is it just lower? Or is it lower like a function like that? And it's interesting because in my day-to-day, I'm working with Python, working with Ruby. Now that this place that I'm working at, they have PHP code base. So while I'm not like primarily a PHP code developer, I have been, poking around in that code, doing things like related to server infrastructure things, like changing backends for certain connection strings. Like basically I'm looking at Python or PHP code on a decent basis now. I think it's that. If not, it's probably too lower, but let's see what happens here. That's totally fine. Meaning now, if we were to change that to be transparency, then this should also still work because, yeah, it's getting converted to lowercase, which is always going to do that. This is pretty nice because, yeah, that means if for whatever crazy reason, like this n needed to be uppercase, then this is going to work as well. But this is not probably the best solution in the world because let's just say that the server type, well, actually, let me chop out one more comma there. Yeah, if that server type doesn't exist, this item get is going to return none, and then none is not going to have lower, and this is probably going to throw an exception there. Yeah, none type has no attribute lower. So then what we could do is just turn this default into an empty string there, and then that should theoretically work. Yes, because why? An empty string is still a string and we can still run lower on it. So this is what I feel is probably a reasonable approach. It takes the case of being a little bit defensive to make sure that things work. Hold on, let me also paste that back in. Oh, off by 1 with them. I always do that. I accidentally paste it like before or after instead of before or something like that, but whatever. Yeah, so now we have a pretty decent amount of resiliency to our code here to make sure the server type could be any different way here. Again, like we're just taking an assumption here that this ID is always going to exist. Otherwise, we want this to throw an exception. We can also, do a try except around this and maybe, do whatever you need to do, like send the error over to Sentry or a Slack note. I don't know, right? Now it becomes like way specific to your application. But yeah, that's the code here. And we can see each individual pseudocode that we had gets translated into specific code here, right? Parse the site response, loop over it, make sure it's transparency, store the item ID, and then, yeah, we have our IDs to do whatever. And what's neat about this approach, I guess, too, is like, if we didn't just want to get the ID, but we wanted to get all of them, then all of them, like the whole item. So yeah, I mean, now the variable name doesn't make any sense here, transparent IDs, even though it's like the actual like transparent items or something like that. However you'd want to describe that, transparent server types or something like that. But yeah, we have this option to very easily now do all sorts of different things that we want. There's other ways to solve this as well. Like if you're more into functional programming, I mean, what we just developed here is basically a filter function, right? So it's like we have this list of objects here, and we're filtering it to only include a specific thing, in this case where the server type is transparency. So you can use the filter function to do that. I'm not going to go through that in Python here, but that is an option there. Interestingly enough, though, I think a more functional approach, at least in my mind, ends up being worse. Not as like a teaching aid or like an endgame solution or whatever, but you don't get the experience of breaking things down with pseudocode there. I mean, I guess you do, where like the next step is like refactor it into like filter function or something like that. But it's almost like too high level that you forget that these are the actual steps to get there. And again, that's like super personal preference, but yeah, let me know in the comments below, like, would you prefer doing a filter function? Now, in this case, I think a filter function would produce a decent amount less code, but if you're working with a different language that's like fully immutable and you wanted to start doing other things, like maybe you want to count something in here and, mutate a variable outside the loop, like suddenly it becomes into like a very complicated thing, at least in my mind. But yeah, I'm happy with this approach here. And, this is basically something I'd probably ship, or at least like, open a PR for it to get reviewed, etc. Based on the current knowledge that we know, just based on the email that, yeah, we have over here. So that is going to do it there. Funny enough, I think I deviated a little bit from the code that I have here. Yeah, so I didn't even get into that whole like making things lowercase in this blog post. Probably by the time that you watch this video, I will update that post just to have that little extra bit there just to handle uppercase and lowercase, because that has definitely come up many times just dealing with APIs. Yeah, sometimes you can't control the API, so you need to code around that to make sure that things work here. And yeah, so like, the takeaway there is once you break your problem up into pseudocode, you could then Google for each step in actual English and then solve each step with code as you go, right? Becomes basically an outline to your program. And funny enough, I think last week was when I made this post here, also made the video, right? Like how I quickly find answers to problems, like Googling and doing those other steps here. So feel free to check that out. I'll leave a card up for this one if you wanted to get into that one. But in addition to that, right, we also have unknown unknowns. Can make problems look way more complex than they really are, right? The person who wrote that email, if they're just learning Python or programming in general, like sometimes we, as like, I guess, experienced developers or whatever, take certain things for granted, like JSON, yeah, it's JSON, like you can just look at that and know, but sometimes you wouldn't know. And in this case, if they thought that text was just like an unstructured string and not JSON, having to parse that as plain text would be, yeah, quite a bit more complicated, right? I thought about it for a little bit. Like, I don't want to go too crazy there, but like you could theoretically have maybe split on just a comma and an opening brace there. Let's see, like if you split on this, then yeah, that would give you the first element, the second element, and the third element. But there's going to be all this noise like brackets and square brackets. Now it's like a big string. And yeah, I basically went on to say here, like you can totally do that and then continue parsing out from there, but it would have been just riddled with all sorts of different edge cases. So I totally get why someone going with that approach would have gotten stuck, especially if they were just getting into programming. But yeah, that's basically it for this video. Let me know in the comments below how you would have solved this problem, either using Python or your programming language of choice, doesn't really matter. It would be interesting to see there. Feel free to, maybe drop them into the comments if it's, a quick 2-liner or something like that, or throw them up into a gist, like whatever, it's up to you. Also, if you liked the video, please give it a thumbs up because it really does help a lot. Thanks a lot for watching, and I will see you in the next video.